Thank you so much, everybody near and far, for being with us tonight. We're very excited about tonight's program. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, I welcome you to tonight's special event. David Lehrer, my buddy, is traveling, but he'll be back with us tomorrow night. I know he's sorry he's missing this special program. A special welcome, as well as a thank you, to Zev Yaroslavsky and Larry Mantle. It is a special honor to present Zev and his memoir tonight. I have known Zev and knew his late wife, Barbara, for most of my life. We've celebrated and shared the ups and downs of life together, and my husband and I were involved in Zev's very first campaign for Los Angeles City Council in 1975. And for years before that, it was Zev's beautiful wife, Barbara, who took my quarter each Wednesday night as I entered UCLA Hillel for Israeli folk dance night. And Zev's father taught every single person in our family at the Los Angeles Hebrew High School. So your memoir not only marks your remarkable achievements as a stellar civic leader, but also takes us on an important personal historical journey, one which so closely parallels the story of so many of our lives, that of American Jews and other immigrant families as well. And thank you to Larry for being with us, and above all, to you, our loyal audience, always curious. Thanks so much for tuning in. Reminder, tomorrow night, we welcome one of the country's most respected political analysts, Ron Brownstein, who set the stage for our 2024 election countdown. Ron will take a look at the political landscape 16 months out and give us his best analysis of what's happening and what to expect in the coming months, so brace yourselves. He will be in dialogue with the always wonderful Pat Morrison. Congressman Mel Levine, another person whom I've known for so many decades, has, like Zev, been a critically important fixture in the political landscape of Los Angeles for the last half century. Both Mel and Zev have worked hand in glove with David Lehrer and me in developing and sustaining This America at a Crossroads series. I am very pleased to invite Mel to formally introduce tonight's guests. Mel?
Janice, thank you very much. This is a great pleasure for me as well. I haven't known Zev as long as Janice has known him. I've only known him for 53 years. Zev and I met in 1972 during the ill-fated McGovern campaign for president. Zev at that time was a young, very engaging, and very effective Soviet Jewry activist at the tender age of 21 or 22. Over the course of those next 53 years, Zev and I have become very, very good friends and have worked very closely together on a huge range of political issues. We have the battle scars to show some of these experiences. But we've always, I think, been on the right side of the issues, and Zev has been, in my view, a study in courage during his entire political career. I could go on about Zev for longer than any of our audience would like, and Larry's going to interview him, so I think a lot of that will be taken care of during the Q&A, during the interview. I want to talk for a moment about his book. I have been blown away by this wonderful book. I read it in 3 days. I don't normally pick up a book and am unable to put it down. But for anybody who's interested in the nuts and bolts of the core issues in Los Angeles over the course of 40 to 50 years, from the 70s through the turn of the century, Zev's book is a masterpiece. In a candid and straightforward way, it captures not only so much of Zev's life, from his impetuous but successful long shot race for the city council at the age of 26, through his many campaigns for re-election and for the Board of Supervisors. And it talks about his very impressive work, both on the city council and on the Board of Supervisors. He candidly describes the battles and values he embraced and opposed during those 40 years. Before getting into those substantive political and public policy issues, the book has an extraordinary portrait of Zev's grandparents and parents, an extremely moving part of the book, and his devotion to his wonderful wife, Barbara, and her devotion to him permeates this book. I've seldom enjoyed a book more. Our audience tonight will have the pleasure of learning some of this, hopefully a great deal of this, as Zev is interviewed by the wonderful interlocutor who we are so proud of and so pleased that he regularly assists us by interviewing our guests, the much honored and greatly loved Larry Mantle. Larry?
Thank you, Mel. I appreciate it so much. It's wonderful to be with you again this evening. And I would echo with what Mel said about Zev's book. Zev's Los Angeles, From Boyle Heights to the Halls of Power, a political memoir. The book with a photo of Zev looking out over downtown Los Angeles. It really gives you a sense of the 40 years in public service and the work that continues with the Los Angeles Initiative at UCLA as well, where he's working with the next generation of presumed leaders here in Southern California. Many of you I know are here in Southern California, so you have a degree of familiarity with Zev. Perhaps you know him very well, and maybe not as much as Janice with extraordinary family background there I wasn't aware of. But certainly his name has been in the news for decades here in Los Angeles, and a figure who's very known, highly regarded, and amazingly, with all the years in public life that he's had, someone who has respect not just from those who share his political perspectives, but those that he's battled with as well. And we'll get into that in our conversation tonight. Zev, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk with you about the book. I want to start, first of all, with your childhood. The early years in the Boyle Heights neighborhood of Los Angeles, an immigrant community, about 40% Jewish, I believe, at the time that you lived there, mixed race and ethnicity. But as Los Angeles's Jewish community moved to the west, to the Fairfax district, West Los Angeles, San Fernando Valley, your family moved as well. And I just wonder if you could speak briefly about the transition of the community and what that move symbolized for you with your family.
Well, first of all, thank you, Larry, and thank you, Mel, for that wonderful introduction, and Janice as well. I grew up in Boyle Heights the first 8 years of my life. Boyle Heights is on the east side of Los Angeles, on the east side of the Los Angeles River. It's the port of entry, always has been and still is, for new immigrants who come to LA. My parents came from the old country, from Ukraine, my dad in 1921 and my mother in 23, along with my grandfather. And in 1937, they moved out to Los Angeles because my grandfather needed a place, as his doctor said, with clean, dry air, which is
well, it's dry.
It's dry. And they settled in Boyle Heights. My parents were both Jewish educators. They were Hebrew teachers. My sister and I grew up speaking Hebrew at home. That was our first language. And my parents ran a labor Zionist school in City Terrace, which is right next to Boyle Heights. And my parents stayed there until they couldn't put a class together. After World War II, the Jewish population began to migrate to where the center of the Jewish community had been growing in the west side, and increasingly in the San Fernando Valley. And my parents moved in 1956 when the last class they could put together graduated, and they moved to the Fairfax area, where I live to this day, 6 to 8 blocks from where I grew up. I'm a sociological anomaly in that regard. So they were humble people. The most prized possessions we had in our home were books. My parents lived paycheck to paycheck. They rented a unit in a duplex, and my parents owned their first home when my dad was 54, and he bought his house for $15,000, sold it for $21,500 15 years later, and thought he had died and gone to heaven. 7 years later, that same house sold for a lot more than that.
One of the things I love when I talk with people about Los Angeles, which they don't quite understand, it can be in some ways kind of a small town. And I love, Janice talking about Mel, knowing you all these years. And you write in the book about people coming up to you, remembering your mom as their Hebrew teacher at Los Angeles City College. And I mean, it just gives you a kind of a sense that there are all these communities in Los Angeles and ways in which it doesn't feel as vast as I'm sure it sometimes was for you, making huge decisions affecting millions of people.
It's like anything else. It's like going to UCLA when I went to college. It's huge, but you find your niche and you create your little community there. Yeah, my mother was one of those teachers who, if you were asked to name the 3 best teachers you had, she would be on the list. She was compassionate. She was less concerned about what grade she was going to give you than that you had a good experience and you learned something. And this afternoon, I had a book signing party in downtown, and a fellow came up to me and he said, "My grandfather was a student of your dad's and your mom's."
Wow.
And this happens all the time. I remember in one of my campaigns early in my career, I was walking door to door. I had been redistricted to a new area, and a journalist wanted to follow me around. The first door I knocked on, I introduced myself, and she said, "Oh my God," she says, "your mother was my Hebrew teacher at LA City College." And I had to beg the journalist after that encounter to implore him that this was not a setup. This happens all the time. It's one of the great things that comes from being well known in town. There are a lot of reasons that are not great, not a lot of things that are not great about being well known, but I've had a lot of interesting experiences. I received a letter from a constituent in Pacific Palisades who said that they understood that my father came from Belyatserkov in Ukraine. It's about 50 miles outside of Kiev. And she wanted me to have a copy of a letter or a report he wrote to his children about his going back to Belyatserkov, this constituent's father, going back to Belyatserkov in 1921. Which is when my dad left, and it's very detailed about what life was like, what it was like for Jews, and just generally as well. And it's a prized possession of mine because my dad never spoke to me about that in such detail. So yeah, my parents were fixtures, and they were union activists. That my dad created the first the Hebrew Teachers Union in Los Angeles in the 40s, and of course he was my teacher, as was my mother, but my mother died when I was 10. So my dad was really my teacher at the LA Hebrew High School for several years. And it's not easy to be the son of the teacher, but he was a great teacher, as was my mom.
And you write very movingly about how the loss of your mother when you were so young, how that affected you. You came up in this environment of a labor Zionist family, and it extended beyond your parents. Your maternal grandfather is a fascinating figure, and you spend considerable time, and I'm glad you do, in the book, because I'm one of those people who I'm more familiar with the political events you were involved with later, although there's a lot of things I was totally unaware of. But learning about your family is fascinating. Tell us about your maternal grandfather briefly.
Well, my maternal grandfather, his name was Shimon Soloveitchik. And for the people in the audience who understand the Soloveitchik name, the best way I can describe it is walking into an Orthodox meeting, and a meeting of Orthodox Jews, and saying you're a Soloveitchik is like somebody walking in Boston and saying they're a Kennedy. It's a family of highly regarded and legendary rabbis, although my grandfather was not religious, in very much a Zionist, but not particularly religious. And he settled down in Poltava, which is a medium-sized city right between Kiev and Kharkov, or Kiev and Kharkiv, we should say now. And for 15, 16 years ran a Hebrew school, a labor Zionist socialist Hebrew school, and really in educating young Jews about going to Palestine and helping to create the Jewish state. My grandmother, whom he married, and he came to the United States in 1923. My grandmother had a lover back in the old country, and she didn't want to leave. The age separation between the two of them was considerable. But they made an agreement that she'd help him set up my mother, who was then 13, my mother to be, and then she went back a year later to Stalinist Russia, to Stalinist Ukraine, where there was a starvation campaign going on, and then moved to Leningrad, where she survived the siege of Leningrad by the Nazis. My grandfather was a genius. He was very literally a genius. He was very comfortable with physics and chemistry and things like that. He drew up models for or blueprints for a helicopter that he didn't know Leonardo da Vinci had worked on hundreds of years earlier. And his students loved him for that. He taught Talmud and Torah and all that stuff, but he also regaled them with stories about physical experiments and things like that. When he came to the United States, it was hard for him. Number one, his wife had abandoned him, and so he was lonely, and he didn't adjust very well to the language, and he didn't adjust very well to the behavior of American Jewish students, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. Those were his students. And I remember reading a letter he wrote back to a friend of his in the old country saying, "The only thing these boys seem to care about is this game called baseball." So he and I would not have hit it off too much on baseball, but he's the one person, people always ask you, who would be the one person in the world you'd like to have met? And the one I'd like to have met would have been my grandfather, who died 8 years before I was born.
Yeah, understandably. Speaking of baseball, you're a huge Dodger fan. You grew up, as I did, with the voice of Vin Scully of the Dodgers, another major influence that you write about in the book. And we certainly share that appreciation for Vin. I want to talk about sort of how this family background factors into you taking on the movement to protect Soviet Jews, which became big around the country, but particularly here in Los Angeles. I remember there were banners up and stickers up. You would go on George Putnam's, which was the highest rated local television program. You went on Ray Bream's overnight radio show on the #1 talk station in Los Angeles. And you really developed a presence in bringing to Americans' attention the plight of Soviet Jews. How did you get involved in that?
Well, I was always curious, Larry. A lot of my friends in school had grandfathers and grandmothers and aunts and uncles. My dad had 2 sisters. My mother had none. And I said, why, I learned about my grandmother who lived in Leningrad and now St. Petersburg. And I learned about my dad's 2 sisters. And then I had my bar mitzvah in 1961, and we got a telegram. I got a telegram from my 2 aunts in Kharkiv. And it said, "Congratulations on your birthday." And every other telegram we got said, "Congratulations on your bar mitzvah, mazel tov on your bar mitzvah," all that, bar mitzvah. And I said to my dad, "What's with happy birthday?" So he said, well, if they had used the word bar mitzvah in a telegram from the Soviet Union, they would run a risk of being harassed, arrested. It was safer just to say happy birthday. That got my attention when I was about 12 and a half, 13 years old. And I began to take an interest in that whole issue. And when I became of age, so to speak, and it was the 60s, there were civil rights, there were protests on any number of things, the Vietnam War. There were no shortage of causes to get involved in, but there weren't a lot of people who were getting involved in the Soviet Jewry issue. And I decided to get involved in that issue. In 1968, I went with my dad to the Soviet Union, visited for a week with my aunts, and it was an eye-opener. And I tell the story in the book that my aunt met me in Moscow. My dad came later, but my aunt met me in Moscow, and she was my tour guide. She took me to Red Square. And I figured it's safe there to talk about almost anything. So I asked her, how is it for Jews in the Soviet Union? And she said, "Shh, the walls have ears." And I looked around, I said, "What walls? The nearest wall is 100 yards away. This is ridiculous." But it made an impact on me. And when I came back to the United States, to Los Angeles, I said, this is what I'm going to devote my time to. And for the next 8 years, from 1968 through 74, 7 years, I just knocked myself out to the point where my doctoral advisor at UCLA, I was in the doctoral program in the history department. I was arrested in a protest for Soviet Jews, and my picture appeared on page 3 of the Sunday Times. And my professor called me into his office and he said, "Mr. Yaroslavsky, when are your academic pursuits going to take up as much of your time as your extracurricular activities?" And that was the day I decided I'm going to get my master's and I'm out of here. I can't.
It's a clarifying moment. Yes.
Yeah, very much so. And he understood. He was no Mr. Holland's Opus here. He didn't beg me to stay. He said, "Good luck to you." And I understand. And it was the hardest thing I ever had to do, was to tell him I was leaving the program. When I got elected in 1975, I received a letter from him. It was Professor John Galbraith, not the economist, but the British Empire historian, very much a towering figure in that field. And the letter went something like this: "Dear Mr. Yaroslavsky, congratulations on your election to the City Council of Los Angeles. I hope Los Angeles's gain is the British Empire's loss. And I hope the city of Los Angeles is in better shape than the empire." And so that closed the loop, and we remained in touch for years after that.
So you decide that you're going to run for what became your Los Angeles City Council seat with two, one at least arguably better known in Roz Wyman, who'd been on the council previously and played a huge role in convincing Walter O'Malley to bring the Dodgers to Los Angeles. She'd been the youngest member of the LA City Council ever, and a very influential woman leader in Los Angeles. So she runs. Fran Pavlich as well, who'd been prominent in the political world. So how was it that you were able to, out of that field of three, finally prevail and win that first election?
Well, I had a base. I had a little base in my neighborhood in the Fairfax, Pico Robertson area. The Jewish community knew who I was. I'd been active for a long time in the Soviet Jewry movement, and they'd seen me at rallies. They'd seen me on radio and television. So it wasn't like I was a nobody. But there was a poll taken, not by me, I couldn't afford a poll, but by Fran Savage, who was Mayor Bradley's, one of his administrative coordinators that he had put up to run for that seat. And they took a poll and it showed that I had 5% of the vote. So did Fran Savage. Roz Wyman had 38% of the vote. So it looked like it was going to be, with the money that Mrs. Savage was going to spend, it would be a runoff between Savage and Wyman. Roz was very well known. As you say, she was the youngest councilwoman ever elected, even to this day. She was 22 years old when she became a councilwoman, and became very good friends with me. And she just died last year at the age of 92. And I just, I didn't think I was going to win. Of course, nobody thought I was going to win. And Barbara and I sat down and, should I run? I really never had an ambition to run for office. I was more interested in policy than in politics. But a lot of the folks that I worked with in the McGovern for President campaign, Mel Levine being one of them, I said, "You ought to think about running for this seat. It's going to be vacant." My predecessor, Ed Edelman, was on his way to becoming a county supervisor. Think about running. This is a good way to start a political career. I talked to Barbara. We had enough savings to pay our bills for 6 months. And I threw my hat in the ring with her enthusiastic support. And I just worked my tail off. I didn't have serious money. I was certainly not well endowed in that regard. And I walked door to door for 5 consecutive months, actually, day and night, rain or shine, every single day. I don't think there was a day that I wasn't walking door to door. And there was an old political consultant that I was close to in the years that ensued, who said, "Every hand you shake is a vote you're banking." And that was kind of in my head every time I walked door to door. And by the time the election was over, people were getting tired of seeing me. "Hey, you came to my door. I saw you at the supermarket. I'm voting for you. I'm voting for you." And it started to become, I started to feel like I was gaining traction, and that there was a chance that I could win.
Yeah, and so you win the primary, you get Wyman to endorse you, beat Savage then in the runoff, and start what is a 20-year career at City of Los Angeles on the council. And so many huge things happened during that time. The 1984 Olympic Games, you had such a prominent role there in making sure Los Angeles would not be bearing any of the costs of those games. And that's the first Olympics to go on and make a massive profit under Peter Uberoth's leadership. The passage of Proposition 13 and the crisis that would come to local jurisdictions as a part of that. But one of the ones I love, I'd like you to just take a moment on, the Diamond Lane on the Santa Monica Freeway. This was dictated out of Sacramento to take one of the regular lanes of traffic. This was not an additional lane that they built, and turn it into essentially a carpool lane. And your constituents understandably flipped out over that. What did you do?
So I'll get to that, but I want to tee it up because you asked me a question earlier, like, what did my ancestors, what did my parents and my grandfather teach me? Even in the case of my grandfather, remotely through his writings, is that get involved in issues that are bigger than you are, and be willing to take risks for the right reasons. Don't be intimidated by by power brokers and special interests. My grandfather and my parents, went up against the czar. I mean, they uprooted themselves from the old country and came here. If it was so easy to do that, they'd all come here. They didn't all come here. So I was raised in an environment where I was taught to fight for social justice, to fight for the right things, and not to be intimidated by the short-term concerns and think about the long-term. So the Diamond Lane, which is not exactly the biggest civil rights issue of all time, but it's by far the biggest mistake, huge snafu by the state of California. They took the busiest freeway in the United States, the Santa Monica Freeway, the I-10, and as you said, they took a lane out of circulation, and they designated that lane for carpools of 3 persons or more. That was to my knowledge, the only HOV, high occupancy vehicle lane, that required you to have 3 people in it. Most of them required 2. And it just created chaos on the freeway and on the streets of the city because people were getting off the freeway because it was took too long on the freeway. And there were 3 lanes of bumper to bumper traffic and 1 lane that was basically empty because nobody was carpooling with 3 people. And nobody wanted to do anything about it. Governor Brown, Jerry Brown, was the governor. My Democratic friends didn't want to take him on this, and one thing led to another, and I filed a lawsuit against the state of California and against the U.S. Department of Transportation. I believe that the case is known as Zev Yaroslavsky versus the United States of America. That's
I assume you take pride in that.
Well, yeah, it's kind of humbling. So. And we went to federal court. The state did not do an environmental impact statement as required by law. It was a slam dunk case. Judge Matt Byrne, a famous federal judge, issued an injunction, and instantly hundreds of thousands of commuters were given a reprieve, and they could get back on the freeway without having to go through the craziness that they were going through for several months. All the while, the state of California said it's working well. This is a myth that it's not working. They had all kinds of statistics. The former cartoonist for the LA Times, Paul Conrad, had I think one of his best cartoons. It was a takeoff on the old Burma shave billboards that used to appear on all the highways of America, and it was 4 billboards. With the 5th one saying Burma shave, and it was a rhyme. So he did a cartoon that said the Diamond Lane is working well. If you don't like it, go to hell, Caltrans. And that said it all. The Department of Transportation of the U.S. Did a post-mortem report on it and just trashed the whole way it was handled. And Joan Didion wrote an essay about the Diamond Lane, and she said that the communiques coming out of Sacramento reminded her of the communiques that used to come out of the Pentagon saying how we were winning the war in Vietnam.
Wow.
Yeah.
Zev, let's talk about your relationship with the LAPD during your city council years. You were a highly vocal critic of Police Chief Gates, Daryl Gates, during that time, the Public Disorder Intelligence Division, which essentially spied on civil rights groups, is one that you went after. You yourself, as you detail in the book, had all kinds of things that were raised about, including that you were a customer of Heidi Fleiss, the madam, and that you saw her during hours when you were at City Hall doing council business, which shows they didn't research that too well and trying to smear you with that one. But
And that's why they call police intelligence an oxymoron.
It's often said that the police chief is the most powerful position in Los Angeles, more so than the mayor. What did you learn from that experience going head to head with Gates?
Well, it was not a problem for me to go head to head with Gates because I had gone head to head with the KGB. I'd made 3 trips to the Soviet Union in 1968, 79, and 74. In 74, we were tailed constantly by the KGB. I was filming refuseniks and dissidents, and and I was playing hide and seek with the KGB basically. So when I came to the city council, the LAPD compared to the KGB was a walk in the park. But one of the things that I go back to is that incident or that conversation with my aunt in Red Square. The walls have ears, and I find, I ask my students at UCLA when they go, who are public policy students, I said, when you get into your job, whether it's an elected official or in a staff position, ask yourself the question, stand in front of the mirror and ask yourself the following question: what issue am I willing to lose my job over? If you can't answer that question, then don't go into public service, because there will come a time when you're going to have to make a very difficult decision, especially if you're going to adhere to to your oath of office, which is to uphold the Constitution, to defend the Constitution of the United States. It's tough to defend the Constitution of the United States because the Bill of Rights portion of it is there to protect the minority against the tyranny of the majority, and that's counterintuitive for an elected official. An elected official wants to make nice to the majority because they're going to elect him next time or re-elect him. And so I for me, the Bill of Rights, freedom of, the separation of church and state, the freedom from being for the government intruding on your personal life or in your private life, was a thing that I was willing to lose my job over. So when I came into office, one of the first things that I did was vote to settle a lawsuit that had been brought by a professor at UCLA who was my professor, Hayden White, a history professor, whom the LAPD had infiltrated. His class was infiltrated with an undercover intelligence officer. Why? Because he was against the Vietnam War. He was not a terrorist. He was not remotely a terrorist. And we had to settle a case that was extremely expensive to the taxpayers. And it went on like that constantly.
And had nothing to do with local issues. I mean, that's the other thing. It's about a national issue, not even something involving the city.
And it was the Public Disorder and Intelligence Division, as it was called, PDID, was not concerned about public disorder. It was concerned about people who had points of view that were different than the police department leadership. That's all it was. The people who were really threats to society were dealt with more with real cops. These people were playing cops and robbers, and it was an embarrassment to the city. And so when PDID was disbanded finally, and I had a lot to do with that, I put that on the map. My name was on their file. My colleague Cy Frumkin, who was my comrade in arms in the Soviet Jewry movement, he was in the file. John Mack, the head of the Urban League, was on the file. Reverend Regas in Pasadena,
All Saints Episcopal Church.
All Saints Episcopal Church was on there. The first AME. I mean, it was not a matter of people who were threats to the public order. These were people who had political views that differed. The LAPD had no business monitoring classrooms, church sermons. I even had an incident where, when I was working on legislation to create a Freedom of Information Act for the city, and the group that was pushing it came into my office for a strategy session. One of the people in that meeting was an undercover police officer. Wow. So yeah, it was just and so for me, it wasn't it wasn't an act of courage. People say, "Oh, you're very courageous." It wasn't courageous. It was the right thing to do. But I will tell you this, Larry.
Real quickly, yeah.
In the days in the 70s, it was very dangerous for a politician in Los Angeles to take on the LAPD because they were the most powerful political force in the city, much more so than the mayor or the city council. Ed Davis, who was the chief of police when I got there, was asked if he was thinking of running for mayor, and he said, "Why would I do that? The chief's office is much more powerful." And so these things were really important to me, to give to not only to end the PDID and other things, but to show that a public official, a city councilman, can stand up to the LAPD and live to talk about it politically. And what happened was, over time, it became de rigueur to take on the LAPD on things that they were doing wrong. We banned the chokehold in 1982 in the city. And that was something that I got deeply involved in. Excessive use of force issues, police.
And the chokehold, of course, was supposed to be a less lethal use of force and supposed to cut down on the number of shootings by officers. But so many people ended up losing their lives in
16 months, 17 people died of the chokehold. All I have to say is George Floyd, and that's. We had a George Floyd here, once a month, and but no videos, and so it went.
We need to move on to the county shortly, but I do want to ask you, 1987, you're all set to run for mayor of Los Angeles against incumbent Tom Bradley, who's been in office forever by that point, and you decide at virtually the last minute to pull the plug to run for re-election for your council seat instead. Bradley suffered a series of setbacks and reporting about his campaign, which raised questions about some of his administration's activities. The exit poll in that mayoral race showed you would have at least, as I recall, pushed him to a runoff. As you look back, I know this is what we're talking 35 years ago, but you ever think about that now and what might have been?
No. And I'm glad you raised the issue, because all of the scandals that were associated with Tom Bradley occurred after the deadline for me to file for the mayor's race. So when I had to make the decision, we did a poll, and it showed Bradley beating me 62-18. Now I had to give up my seat to run. And so one of the things I was not willing to lose my seat over was a stupid, reckless decision to run against a guy who was unbeatable. And that's the way it looked to me in early January of 1989. However, once he got, once the campaign was going and the Herald Examiner actually broke the story, the now defunct Herald Examiner, his numbers started to drop. Now, if I had known that in January or December, it might have been different. But the thing that I always I laugh at the exit poll, because if I had wings, I could fly. Of course, I would have forced him into a runoff by then, but that wasn't the information I had at the time. And I do not regret the decision at all, because the ensuing 24, 25 years turned to be much
worked out pretty well. And arguably being a county supervisor is just about the best political gig that anyone can get. Over the years, I've been asked by people, would you ever consider running for office? I said, no. I prefer interviewing elected officials. The only one that would even tempt me is a county supervisor position. And I want to get to that because it has tremendous power. There are only 5 of you with a county that is larger than most American states by far, and controls the delivery of healthcare services, huge arts organizations, a wide range of different social services that the county presides over. When you were elected, succeeding Ed Edelman again, who had retired from the board, how different was that job, just stepping into it at the beginning? Did it feel hugely different than being a city councilman?
Completely different, because in the county of Los Angeles, and it's in the state constitution, the county governing body is the Board of Supervisors. And of the 58 counties in California, 57 of them have the same structure. 5 members of the Board of Supervisors, no elected executive, no elected mayor. It's different than the East Coast, where you have a county executive. We had none of that. So number one, we were an executive branch. And as a city councilman, I was really a legislator, quasi-executive, quasi-judicial, but mainly a legislator. When I come to the county, first of all, the county issues are largely human service issues. The county is the human service arm of our society: welfare, child welfare, mental health, health care for the uninsured, criminal justice. It's not a middle class level of government. It's a lower income, the poverty and of which we had plenty. Those were our response. They were those people who were on the margins of our society were our responsibility. So I never got any calls. In the city council, the phone never stopped ringing off the hook. In the county, the phone hardly rang. And after 8 or 9 months, I called my staff together and I said, people aren't coming to us because they got to work for a living. They can't hire a lobbyist. They couldn't afford one or a consultant. We've got to go out and find them. We know we have poverty in our district. We know where it is. We need to be, present in their lives. And that became kind of a seminal moment in my career as a county supervisor, aside from which I also learned how to be an executive, which I'd never been before. And you don't have to call a hearing when something is wrong. You just fix it, as my chief of staff told me at the time. And once you get your feet on the ground there at the county, it is the most powerful job outside of maybe the mayor of New York. Richard Nixon once is rumored to have said that if he couldn't be president of the United States, the next best job would be an LA County supervisor.
Yeah, probably whether he said it or not, it's probably true. Yeah. So I want to talk about your reputation for fiscal responsibility, and that I mentioned earlier, the 1984 Olympics and the measure that you authored to take to voters to make sure that the city wasn't on the hook for that. But there was the financial crisis of 1995 for the county. And just briefly share with us, because it was complex, how that was all woven together to allow the county to fulfill. But this must have been like 24/7 to keep the county afloat at that time.
Well, I got good training, Larry, because Prop 13 in 1978, where a huge chunk of the city's revenues were just disappeared because of the tax reform measure. We had a crisis, we dealt with it, and that's when I learned how it's like a depression baby. The people who lived through the depression never wasted money. After Prop 13, I was very conscious of taxpayer money. So when I came to the Board of Supervisors, I was sworn in on December 5th, 1994 at 11 a.m. At 3 p.m., Orange County, California declared bankruptcy. And that was a shock to all of local government in California. And a few days later, the chief administrative officer of the county came in and told us that we have a structural deficit of about $1 billion. And at that time, the budget of the county was $11 billion. And we're going to have to make some very drastic cuts, including closing 4 of the 5 hospitals that the county ran. And all of a sudden, we're in a crisis again. And without getting into the weeds, basically, we put together a team of experts, 5 people, led by Bert Margolin, who was the former State Assembly Health Committee chair. We gave him 30 days. It took him a little more than that, not a lot more, to give us a solution that we could take to the federal government to get us out of this mess. And in a span of 6 months, we were able to get the Clinton administration to work out a deal with us to reform our health care delivery system, to put more emphasis on outpatient care and less on inpatient care. Bill Clinton came to Santa Monica Airport and announced the deal. And the rest, as they say, is history. They bailed us out of a very difficult situation. It wasn't this simple. Yeah. I can tell you.
I remember covering it, and trying to stay on top of the story was so challenging. And all of us who watch this were kind of amazed when the hospitals were able to continue operating. I want to take some viewer questions. Hopefully we'll have time to get to Walt Disney Concert Hall and your work in the arts with the Hollywood Bowl and the rehabilitation of the Bowl, LA County Museum of Art. But Sue asks if you feel the number of seats on the Board of Supervisors should be increased given the massive size of LA County.
I do, provided that there is also that we also create an elected executive, because right now the county is a $40 billion corporation. It has 5 supervisors who share the executive responsibilities of the place. And you can't, no state in the union would run their state without a governor, but replace their governor with a 5-member board. No corporation, private corporation would do it that way. So to take a board of supervisors from 5 to 7 or 9 or 11 and not have an elected executive, if you don't like the board of supervisors the way it's structured now, you sure won't like it any better when they have 11. It's very difficult. And we saw that during the pandemic. The public health director of the county, who's a terrific administrator, Dr. Barbara Ferrer, she had some very difficult decisions to make, but there were 5 different shades of opinion among the board members. And she had to negotiate with, and this is my observation, it's not something she said to me. I don't want to get her into trouble, and she shouldn't get into trouble for this, but I saw it. I know how the county works. You go to the 5 supervisors and say, I'm thinking of putting together closing the schools. I'm thinking of recommending masks for everybody. I'm closing restaurants, whatever the issue was. And she would go from one supervisor to the next, and one wanted to shut everything down. One didn't want to shut anything down. And then there were shades in between.
So if you had a chief executive for the county, could that person be the one who
absolutely
synthesizes?
I could give you 1,000 examples of where having a chief executive who's elected would make all the difference in the world.
Okay.
Why? Because that person is accountable politically to all the people of the county, not just 1/5. So there's nobody in charge, basically. When 5 people are in charge, nobody's in charge. So whether it was that or the closure of Martin Luther King Hospital, which was a very painful thing we had to do, it would never have gotten to that point if we had one person in charge, because that person would not have let it get this far out of control, because it would have been an existential political threat to that elected executive's career.
On a personal note, Mary in Australia wants to know if Yiddish was spoken in your family growing up.
Well, good day. I love Australia and I love Sydney. I have a lot of good friends there. Yiddish was spoken between my mother and father and my sister. My sister is older than I am. I won't say by how much. She takes offense at that. But she was old enough to master 2 languages, Hebrew and Yiddish. My parents did not speak Yiddish to me. When my parents wanted to speak to each other so that their kids wouldn't understand anything, they spoke Russian. And the only word I remember other than da and yet in our household was the word ostorozhno, which my mother used to scream at the top of her lungs when my dad was driving his car. It means be careful. And so when I took my first Russian class at UCLA, somebody almost tripped coming into the classroom, and the professor yelled ostorozhno, and I said, I know that word. No, we didn't speak Yiddish, but we spoke Hebrew, and I still speak Hebrew fluently, not as fluent as my sister does, but I get along pretty well.
Howard asks, what was the responsibility of City Council and County Board of Supervisors on the delay on installing mass transit through Beverly Hills and the West Side? Because you, of course, are someone who has been, for those who are big supporters of subways and mass transit, have said that you held those projects up.
No, I didn't hold those projects up, and I spoke to a group at the MTA this morning about that. That's a myth that has no basis in fact. There were 2 issues. One was an explosion, and this is getting too much of the weeds, but there was an explosion in the Fairfax district that got Henry Waxman upset. And
this was the Ross Dress for Less.
Ross Dress for Less explosion in 1986, and Waxman was never warmed up at that point in time to a subway, and I'll tell you why. Because the MTA it wasn't the MTA then, it was the Rapid Transit District, was walking around with these big poster boards of what Fairfax Avenue could look like. It was a canyon of 11-story, beautiful reflective glass buildings, which had no place being in the Fairfax neighborhood, commercial buildings. And I think that got Henry's attention, because in those days, for the LA residents who are listening, the Fairfax area was not largely, but had a significant senior citizen population. And gentrification, as we now call it, would have pushed those people out completely. And so Henry should not be faulted for that. I did not agree with him. He put a bill through as a result of the explosion that prohibited the construction of the subway in that methane zone in the West Side. I did not agree with him on that. The city council took a position against that bill, but it passed, and that's the way it was. 12 years later, Metro, the MTA, was about to go bankrupt because everybody on the Metro board, they represented all quadrants of the county, wanted a subway, even when a subway was not called for. And we were on the verge of bankruptcy. And the board of supervisors never met the board of the MTA never met a contract that they didn't want to award for constructing a subway. And so I launched an initiative in 1998, 12 years after the Waxman legislation, to prohibit the use of sales tax money that we generate here for tunneling. And the projects that were under construction continue to be under construction. The valley section of the subway was completed. The line through Hollywood was completed, but the one to the west side and the one to the east side were not.
Okay.
Now, yeah.
Yeah,
But
we're
let me
really
just
Yeah,
finish
real quickly, Zev,
the one thought. I'll be quick. Once the MTA got its finances together, and Mayor Villaraigosa, myself, and former Assemblyman Katz, all of whom were on the board of the MTA, initiated a change in the law. We put an initiative on the ballot, a tax measure on the ballot that funded the subway expansion. So the subway now is under construction all the way to UCLA, actually all the way to the West Los Angeles Veterans Administration. I'm a supporter of the subway in the places where there's enough density to sustain it. And those three places are downtown, Hollywood, and the Wilshire Corridor.
Judy asks, given your support of the arts, do you still support protesting cultural events sponsored by politically objectionable countries, as you did in the 60s and 70s against Soviet performances?
Yeah, we did not protest the performances. We didn't ask people not to go in to see the Bolshoi or the Moiseyev Dance Company. We weren't against the artists. It was an informational picket. That's the way we operated. We never asked anybody not to go to the program. On the contrary, we wanted as much interchange between our local population and them, to the extent that you could reach them, the Russians, the Soviets, so that they could hear what our beef was. So no, I've never been an advocate for boycotting cultural events, even ones that I don't agree with, or from countries that I don't agree with. The arts are a very important way for people who have differing points of view to get into the same room and find what commonalities they have.
David and Gail ask, with the recent stories of corruption with the Los Angeles City Council, were you aware of corruption during your tenure?
We had some, compared to what's going on now and what has gone on in the last few years, we had small-time corruption. We had a member of the city council who pled guilty to one count of bribery, and I don't remember how much he was bribed for, but it was not $500,000 in cash. I can tell you that. It was relatively small. We did not have the same kind of the same level of corruption. I've been asked that a lot lately. Why do we have so much corruption? And I have to give it more thought. I mean, first of all, the first thing we have to do is elect people who are honest, and that's on the public too. Voters need to take the time to scrutinize their candidates. What is their background? Where do they come from? Not geographically, but where do they come from philosophically? What do they believe in? They work in a community-based organization or what? So I think the people have a responsibility, but the members of the board or the city council or the legislature or of Congress also have to be responsible. And then there needs to be some inspector general structure, some accountability tool that will hold people accountable early in the process of the corrupting individual, rather than wait until the FBI or somebody gets into it and the damage has been done. But it is a problem, and it's not just a problem in Los Angeles. It's across the country, and it's at all levels of government. So I don't know what it is that is making it. One of the things, Larry, we talked about it the other day, is that robust local journalism is a thing of the past. Not completely. In Los Angeles, we have some pretty robust investigative stories, but pound for pound, it's nothing like it was 25, 30 years ago, when the papers really held politicians accountable. I used to have an old saying in my office to my staff and to myself: don't do anything today that you don't want to read on the front page of the LA Times tomorrow. And if you just follow that axiom, you'll be fine.
We have Philip asking, what are your thoughts on the monumental problem of homelessness in Los Angeles County? Why do these problems seem to be insurmountable? And why does it cost upwards of $800,000 to construct a supportive housing unit?
Yeah. Well, I don't know why it costs, and it shouldn't cost $800,000 to build a supportive housing unit. And when I was on the board of supervisors, I launched a pilot program that demonstrated that you could take motels, rent motel rooms, convert them into either intermediate or permanent supportive housing, and they didn't cost anything like that. But look, is it insurmountable? It seems like it, but it isn't. But the thing that we have to, that I, as an elected official, used to say, and I implore all of my successors to say, this problem didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight. And you've got to be honest with the public. I'm asked, what will be the metric for Mayor Karen Bass, our new mayor, and she's doing a great job on this issue, among others. What will it take for people to believe that she's made progress? And I've told her this, and I say it to this audience, that number one, we have to quantify the number of people we've housed net, and that goes without saying. But secondly, and equally as important, the public has to feel like we have made a dent in the problem. So there are fewer homeless. The day when we have fewer homeless people, unhoused people in tent encampments on the streets, and we feel it, I think people will be encouraged. The old line, nothing succeeds like success. Karen Bass has to show some success. I think she's beginning to do that. It's going to take time. And the one thing we should never do is overpromise and underperform. It's better to underpromise and overperform. And I think we can do it. The thing that's driving it more than anything is the economic divide, the income gap we have in our city, in our county, and in the country. There's just too many people who are making too little to be able to afford any kind of a housing unit. Almost 40% of the households in Los Angeles County earn a household income of less than $60,000 a year. That's household income. And about 40% of those are earning less than $30,000 a year. You can't live in Los Angeles on $30 or $40 or $50,000 a year with a family of four. It's impossible. And until we solve that part of the equation, we're going to have a problem.
Zev, we need to wrap again. The book, Zev's Los Angeles. It's a political memoir from Boyle Heights to the halls of power. Zev, you give us about a 30-second wrap up and just maybe talk about what you want others to understand about public service as if you've done it.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for a great hour. The one thing I would say is public service is a great calling, and it's been a privilege for me to serve. I never considered myself an owner in my office. I was always a renter. I didn't have a lot of personal belongings or pictures and things like that. The purpose of being in public service is to help the public and to serve the public. I was guided by, and I'll conclude with this, by an old saying from a 19th century British historian, Lord Thomas Macaulay, who said, "No man is fit to govern great societies who hesitates about disobliging the few who have access to him for the sake of the many we never see." And that was my guidepost. Serve the people we never see. the wealthy, the well-connected, they can take care of themselves. But
Right.
every public official should be concerned about the people we never see. And you can do it. It's government can work. That was my mantra. Is I felt like a preacher proselytizing for my religion, and my religion was, I'm going to convince you that government can work for you. And when you do that, I've scored. And
Yeah.
that's what guided me. Thank you very much. Larry.
Thank you. And the book is in fact inspirational because Zev shares in all these different experiences, many of which we didn't have time to get to. Like, for example, getting Walt Disney Concert Hall over the hump. And you'll read in the book about the battle between the famed architect Frank Gehry and Eli Broad, who's putting so much money into it, and all this kind of backstage things that the stories just don't lend themselves to the time we have here. But again, it's all in Zev's Los Angeles. Wonderful anecdotes from his career in public service. Zev, thank you so much. And as someone who covered you for all those years, or many of those years in office, thank you for your accessibility. You're talking about local media, the fact you always made yourself available to defend or to talk about what you could have done better or your colleagues done better. You were always accessible to media. So thank you so much.
And you were the best, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Zev. Want to remind you that it continues tomorrow night with the usual Wednesday night program. It'll be my friend Pat Morrison of the Los Angeles Times, the Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, in conversation with the Atlantic and CNN's Ron Brownstein. If you're a regular attendee of these, you know how fascinating Ron is with his political analysis. Noted journalist and data analyst Ron Brownstein with Pat Morrison tomorrow at 5 o'clock Pacific, 8 o'clock Eastern, right here on America at a Crossroads. Thank you so much for joining us, and remind you that you can support these nonprofits that put on the program at either Jews United for Democracy and Justice or Community Advocates, Inc. Thank you and have a terrific rest of the evening.